The field of art history has long been a conservative one. As academic disciplines go, old-fashioned and resistant to change. Imbued, one might say, with the values of entrenched elites, in fact. And this is rather odd, considering that it's a relatively young field, having been founded in Germany in the mid-18th century, child of the Enlightenment. In the post-war period, in Europe and England, as well as the United States, the field of art history shifted away from a model of connoisseurship and what Rosalind Krauss called the art history of the proper name, through various revisions influenced by Marxist political economy, post-structuralism, feminism, post-colonial theory, and other critical discourses. When I was in college, not so terribly long ago, the Department of Art and Art History split in two, in fact. The artists complained, with, I think, good reason, that the historians didn't respect them. And the art historians felt, again, probably with good reason, that the artists didn't like them very much. So one department became two. Until recently, art history professors refused to allow their doctoral students to write dissertations on art that was less than 50 years old. Contemporary art, they reasoned, didn't count as art history. Today, that has changed. Rumor has it, this is unsubstantiated but widely repeated, that approximately 80% of art history dissertations are written on contemporary art, or what in the field is simply called contemporary. Oh, she does contemporary. Why is that? I would hypothesize that this trend has the same root causes as the rise of the contemporary art market as compared to the market for older art. The same root causes as the rise of contemporary art museums. There are so many more today than there were a half century ago. And also the popularity of contemporary art exhibitions at encyclopedic museums like the Met, for example. What might this common root cause be? As tonight's speaker argues in a recent book, quote, art links social elites, sophisticated philosophy, a spectrum of practical skills in representation, a mass public, a discourse of attributed meaning to images, financial speculation, and assertions of national and ethnic identity. This is to say, he writes, that art has a unique form of power. Sounds pretty good to me. To me, tonight's speaker, David Joselit, represents a transformation of the field of art history from one that was hostile to contemporary art and culture to one that engages the contemporary with both intellectual rigor and a deep well of informed perspective. He's well loved by artists and curators, speaks and writes to and about contemporary artists, and even does studio visits. David approaches art history as a history of image circulation. So we often understand images to circulate in a kind of economy. And David applies a framework, an intellectual framework of political economic analysis to this circulation. David has written about Marcel Duchamp's ready-mades, in which commodities are reframed as artworks, about the ecology of television in the mid-20th century, about video art, about media activism, and about the current conditions of contemporary art in relation to globalization and digitization. He started out as a curator at the ICA in Boston, I think when David Ross was the director there. He taught in the art history and visual studies programs at UC Irvine, which at the time was a real hotbed of critical theory and post-structural thought, and also in the art history department at Yale, where he served as chair until I think 2009. He's now a distinguished professor of art history at the CUNY Graduate Center, so we're very happy to have him full-time here in New York. David's art criticism has spanned all the visual media and recently has engaged with contemporary painting in particular, and that's what he's going to talk about tonight. He's the author of a few books, including Infinite Regress on Marcel Duchamp, American Art since 1945, which is in Thames and Hudson's World of Art series, and also Feedback, Television Against Democracy, and last but not least, After Art, published by Princeton University, and that was the book from which I took that quotation earlier. He's an editor of the journal October, for which we will forgive him, and a frequent contributor to Artforum. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to David Joselit.
Thank you, Mark, for that really nice, award-winning introduction. That was really very touching. And I will just say that October is one of those things, it completely escapes political correctness because everyone has license to hate October. So it's kind of one of those, last remaining groups that can be demonized. So I want today to consider how this comparison raises questions regarding alterity in painting between a work by Pablo Picasso, Les Demoiselles D'Alabama, and Robert Colescott's repetition, let's say, or interpretation, Les Demoiselles D'Alabama of 1985. And as we'll see, there's another version as well. Let me define alterity according to the dictionary, so we're all on the same page in terms of how I'm defining this. Alterity is the fact or state of being other or different. Diversity, difference, otherness, an instance of this. Now, there are obvious similarities and differences between these works, not least that one is made by a European white male and the other by an African-American man. But before we can get to the point of making an adequate comparison, which I hope will open out to a broader understanding of modern painting in general rather than just a reading of these two works, we need to consider how each of them stages alterity in its own terms. So I'm going to start by thinking about Picasso and then Colescott. And so I'll move from territory that is absolutely canonical to territory that is less canonical. And for some of you, this may be a little Art History 101 review, but I want to build upon well-known interpretations in order to slightly amend their significance and to put them into conversation with practices that they're not generally in dialogue with. So art historians have long recognized Picasso's search for inspiration in at least two forms of art that are remote for him, that are indicated on the slide in front of you. The first is an alterity between Europe and Africa, as marked by the famous presence of the African mask, the Grebo mask, which constitutes one of the early and important instances of what would later be called and roundly criticized as primitivism. And the Grebo mask coming from the Ivory Coast or Liberia, and my former dissertation advisor, Yves Lambois, has made a strong reading of this mask as a model of a kind of differential or purely abstract composition where, for instance, the eyes can be cylinders, but we still recognize them as eyes, and therefore there's an inspiration to Picasso, not only through the kind of foreignness of the work, but also its semiotic abstraction. Again, this is well-known primitivizing territory that's been criticized for years. But there's a second kind of well-known alterity in this painting, a temporal as opposed to spatial alterity, which is introduced by Picasso's interest in ancient Iberian sculptures. I'm showing you an example on the left. He, of course, comes from Spain, and so one could say that the ancient Iberian heritage, which he would have seen examples of at the Louvre, was an interest which is less celebrated in art history, but one equally important to Picasso, as you can see in the inscription of these faces here, the Grebo mask being related to the Africanized faces of the demoiselle on the right of the painting. So on the one hand, then, we have an alterity that is intra-European, that is within Europe, but temporally distant, the ancient heritage of Iberian art versus contemporary modernism launched by a Spanish citizen in Paris. And the other is spatial and cultural in that it creates a difference between an imperial center or an imperial capital, Paris, and colonial territory in Africa. Now, there's another set of comparisons that are well known that we can make between the demoiselle and a long tradition of the bather or the odalisque, the nude female, which in a classical context introduced mythical or allegorical content into a carnal form of embodiedness. And here, Ingres's Turkish bath, already a kind of orientalizing version of this from 1862, might be an example of the type of bather series of nude figures, which are, again, here in this case, positioned both in spatial distance from Europe, but also in a kind of gender differentiation. The modernity of Ingres's version lies in its exaggeration and multiplication of the nude. They're almost kind of like mechanical dolls that are replicated, and you can see this in the sort of strange recession where they almost seem to go on infinitely into the distance. And its transposition from a mythological or allegorical context where the nude would have represented something like history or other forms of allegorical figuration to one rooted in the alterity of Orientalism, closely linked to European colonial ambitions in the East. And of course, there is one of the greatest chestnuts of art history here, so I am performing the conservativeness of the discipline on some level, but hopefully to make it swerve on some level. The distance between Titian's Venus of Urbino and Manet's Olympia, and how these two, this is the kind of locus classicus of the shift from an early modern use of classicism in the Renaissance to its modern revision. It's well summarized by the feminist critic Eunice Lipton's 1975 account of how stereotype is deployed in the work of Manet. She wrote, "The dynamic of Manet's special brand of realism was to start with a time-honored theme or convention." So in this case, the convention is the reclining nude. Some people think that the Titian was a kind of bride portrait, a sort of, because of the young child peeking into the chest in the background, for instance, in The Attendant. So there is a kind of European type of the reclining nude that Manet takes. This is Lipton's point. But what he does, she continues, is to emphatically withhold its most characteristic traits. On the one hand, he upheld the element of tradition, crucial to the dynamic of his realism. On the other hand, he unmasked it as the anachronism, disguise, or delimiting social ritual that he saw it to be. In other words, he made an equation between reclining nude and beckoning prostitute, which is how Olympia is generally interpreted, with her attendant holding the bouquet of an admirer who has presumably entered the room and caused Olympia to look out toward him. Now, the interesting thing here is that in this history, a type is adopted and transformed in a variety of ways. First, it's transformed from goddess, Venus, to prostitute in one step of, let's say, modernization or de-allegorization. And in the other step, the idea, and you, perhaps some of you know that in fact, the Demoiselles d'Avignon were actually based on 5 women who were in a brothel in a whorehouse. And the original compositions included two clients, a student and a sailor coming in. That's partly how we know the derivation of the scene. So in a way, what we have here is a transposition not only to a kind of commercial reality from goddess of love to purveyor of love for a price. Here, the whole idea of a body or an attraction to a body is broken down. So there's a progressive breaking down of these traditions in the way that Lipton talks about taking a stereotype and somehow undoing it, perversely reversing it. Now, all of these comparisons I'm making are almost painfully well known. My point is that in standard accounts, one or the other of them is emphasized rather than understanding them as a dynamic economy of difference. In other words, there are feminist readings of this painting. There are readings that have to do with the social surrounding of prostitution, etc. What I would like to argue is that, to go back to Mark's generous remarks at the beginning, I would like to argue that, in fact, we see here an economy of alterity, of different kinds of alterity or otherness that are crystallized or juxtaposed, perhaps even, within the painting. There's alterity in time, which is intra-European. Again, it's a kind of European heritage that is remote in time, but within the European tradition. There's alterity in culture, which is remote in space and in ethnicity and cultural norms. And there's alterity in type, the taking of a stereotype or a motif that is as old as European painting and reinventing it. I wish to propose that modern art has not to do with flatness or abstraction or modernization of the urban center or any of these things in isolation, but with the convergence of these three types of alterity. It's my goal to understand what particular forms develop from this formation. In other words, what is modern is in fact the introduction of a variety of different types of otherness within Western painting. Western painting is creating an economy of difference that is actually quite complex in its negotiation of differences of different sorts. In order for this reading to work, though, I think my comparison needs to work. And the reason for this is I believe that Colescott's work, made by an African-American artist at the other end of the 20th century from Picasso, also generates a triple alterity, which I will outline for you next. And while the differences in their articulation, which are plain to see in the paintings themselves, are hugely important, their structural similarities in the staging of a triple alterity, of an economy of difference that has a temporal axis, a cultural axis, and a spatial axis, puts these paintings in the same, what Foucault would call episteme, in other words, the same worldview, the same domain of knowledge. I'm one of those people who believe they're not that, I don't know if there are that many of them, but that modern art actually never died, that postmodern art is a kind of continuation of these terms. And in order to make sense both of forms of figuration like Colescott's that have been sidelined not only because of his being black, but because of its being figurative after the moment of modernism, that one of the ways of kind of rethinking what modern art is that will allow us to understand the contemporary as part of the modern tradition and genealogy is to rethink the modern in terms of this triple economy of alterity. That's my proposition that I'll try to sketch out to you today. So I'm going to cheat a little, make life a little bit easier for myself by thinking about the triple alterity in Colescott's work by using a different example and returning to the comparison with which I started. And that is a comparison between his work, George Washington Carver, Crossing the Delaware, page from an American history textbook from 1975, the same year, not coincidentally, as the Eunice Lipton text I read to you a moment ago about the stereotype, and one of the best-loved paintings of American history, Emanuel Leutz's Washington Crossing the Delaware from 1851. So this is a reinterpretation, as I mentioned, of one of the most famous painterly renditions of American history, George Washington's Crossing of Delaware, as part of a surprise attack on Christmas of 1776. Colescott's painting marks several kinds of repetition. First, the adoption of the painting, the Leutze painting, as a kind of a score. And here I want to insist on the difference between appropriation as a kind of exact mimetic reproduction of something and the taking of an earlier work as a kind of score to interpret, as one would interpret a piece of music, for instance, or interpret a performance event, as Fluxus artists often did from minimal scores. Different artists would reinterpret the same. So I would argue that taking a painting from an earlier moment does not necessarily mean that it is a kind of simple appropriation, but that it can be a kind of score for a new performance of that painting. Second, the important repetition of the name George Washington and that of George Washington Carver needs to be marked. Carver was an African-American agricultural scientist and inventor who is one of the very few African-American icons of the 18th and early 20th century. As Colescott himself put it, in describing both Carver and the other figures in the painting, quote, "I was talking about the way U.S. history was taught when I was growing up. There were two blacks mentioned as significant in U.S. history, George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington, just two. By contrast, the menial workers, Stephen Fetchett's, Aunt Jemima's, boot blacks, etc., were too well known to us and to everyone. Their influence weighed heavily when we were only allowed two heroes in all U.S. history," end quote. So whether in jest or in seriousness, I think in both, actually, and one of my points in the broader set of lectures, this is actually one of 4 lectures I'm giving at the Maryland Institute College of Art on painting, and part of my point, which will only come up peripherally in this lecture, has to do with the introduction of comedy into modern art as an alternative genealogy to modernism. Some of that will become clearer. I just want to point to it. Anyway, I think he's being both comic and tragic in saying that the great African-American heroes that he grew up with included more racist stereotypes, such as bootblacks, Aunt Jemimas, etc., than they did heroic figures, in this case, both absorbing or appropriating, rescoring the name of George Washington, including George Washington Carver. Note that the title also marks the importance of historical difference. In page from an American history textbook is the kind of subtitle. So what you see in this painting then is Carver himself at the head of the ship and a series of racist stereotypes, including an Aunt Jemima performing fellatio and a man playing the banjo at the stern of the ship. So let's think about what kind of the triple alterity that I proposed with regard to the Demoiselles d'Avignon in terms of the work here of Robert Colescott. First, there is an alterity in time, which is obviously marked through his reinvention, reperformance, his reiteration of the Leutze painting some 100 years later. Secondly, there is an alterity in culture, which is introduced through around the pivot of the name George Washington, which includes both the white first president of the United States in general, and the African American intellectual and leader, George Washington Carver. Thirdly, there is the alterity in type, where here there is a difference between, instead of going along an art historical axis, as the Demoiselles had in taking the odalisque or nude allegorical figure and comparing it to the prostitute that has been sort of cubistically disseminated, we have instead the alterity between a racist stereotype that, that circulated in popular culture and how that stereotype is reiterated within the, usually the most celebrated medium of fine art, painting. So I would like to argue then, as I proposed a few moments ago, that, that we think of a kind of long modernism that would include both Picasso and Colescott, rather than being defined formally as a teleological development toward flatness or abstraction, which in fact is contradicted by the multiple persistences and returns of figuration in modern art from the very beginning. Modern art really wasn't ever preponderantly abstract. Or second, through dichotomous oppositions, such as those between the West and Africa, classicism and modernism, white and African American people, but rather, as I proposed earlier, as, and here I'm going to give my definition, a complex, formal, and symbolic negotiation of the triple alterity of history, culture, and stereotype. In other words, modern art is, in fact, a negotiation of this alterity. It's a formal sort of negotiation or a formal recalibration of this triple relation of otherness. This is a definition based on structural conditions, what might be called in French theory a dispositif, or a kind of model or framework, and thus many different formal solutions may be considered modern. This is very important to the argument I'm trying to make. The modern has nothing, well, that's too polemical. The modern is not rooted definitionally in form, a certain kind of form, any kind of form, but rather in its articulation of this triple alterity. So modern works of art can look extremely different, but still conform to this model. To understand the multiplicity that this model affords, let me go back over the points I've made about Picasso and Colescott and compare their different expressions of each category of alterity. So, in terms of alterity in time, Picasso engages with an ancient source that is linked to his Spanish heritage, but which he subsumes within the formal logic of the painting in a manner that has been understood as an inspiration for Cubism. So it's a kind of reference that is simplifying, one could say primitivizing, but it does not signify on its own terms. It's absorbed into a disruption of the language of Western modernism, Western painting. For Colescott, this alterity is more piquantly historical. It's a parodic repetition whose relation to history is directly cited in his rather laborious title, George Washington Carver, Crossing the Delaware, page from an American history textbook. So there is a kind of introduction of the vagaries and cruelties of history in the very title of the work, in the sense that the alterity in time is one that, that shows the contradiction in justice in terms of the American model. So George Washington, this is an icon of American pride in its values of equality that has been turned through its alterity in time to an icon of racism and white supremacy. In terms of the alterity of culture, Picasso appropriates an artifact from an African culture which is to him exotic. His interest is formal, and he felt no obligation to gain knowledge of the origins and meanings of that work. In other words, it was purely an exotic, strange object. It did not for him carry specific value as a form of cultural knowledge. Colescott's rupture is intracultural. It's within the American culture. It's not outside of the United States, but it's an ethnic rupture, which you could say is true of the African case as well, but it has to do with a spatial difference between metropolitan center, European center and colony. Here it has to do with the institution of slavery and racism in the United States. So here, what I want to make clear is that the types of alterity are structurally analogous, but the specifics, their singularity, are always different. So we have to start thinking about how to think about these practices in terms of both a kind of structural set of shared issues and also the constant opportunity and expressiveness of a real singularity, of a specificity of every utterance. And then finally, of course, alterity in type. While it is certainly debatable, we could say that Picasso's work on type is deconstructive, while Colescott's is satirical. So there's a different attitude here. The idea of the nude is broken down into its constituent parts, into its rhetoric. How we draw a nude, how we make a nude, is the how of it is more emphasized here than the what of it. Whereas here there is a kind of satirical device where a racist stereotype is exaggerated in order to create satire. So again, there is a shared alterity, but a very different rhetorical approach toward that alterity. Ultimately, the test of my model of a triple alterity must be on the grounds as the grounds of modern painting, must be in the formal reckoning of this alterity within individual artworks. In other words, if it doesn't work with the archive we're concerned with, if it doesn't actually help us to understand painting in the 19th and 20th and 21st century, then it's useless. I believe we can carry out this exercise with any number of painters of the 20th and early 21st century, but I'm going to stay with our two examples. I want, however, to polemicize the notion of alterity and also the suppression of African Americans within art history until recently by putting aesthetic pressure on a famous historical declaration by the African American thinker W.E.B. Du Bois. In 1903, just 4 years before Picasso's Demoiselles D'Alabama was completed, Du Bois famously declared in the first paragraph of his Souls of Black Folk that, quote, "the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." Now, I tend to be drawn to formations that have both a chromatic and a social dimension. And if you're interested in that kind of intersection, you might look into Darby English's sort of recent book from a couple of years ago called 1971, A Year in Color, where he talks about abstraction among African American artists as a play between the meaning of color as a kind of abstract DNA within painting and also as a kind of social formation of ethnic diversity or racism. So in a way, I want to do something somewhat similar here by thinking what it means to take seriously within the study of art Du Bois's idea that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. How might that allow us to think differently about both art and politics in the United States? Or leave it at that. I want to propose that we take this declaration seriously and even rather literally to see how we might be able to write a different history of modern painting, which obviates the need, by the way, of taking Colescott as postmodern. Let's first consider what would constitute the color line in Picasso. To give away my conclusion at the start, I think that the color line might be linked to the Cubist line. The famous impact of African masks on this painting, in fact, introduces disruptions of both color and line in the work. They undertake an alterity between the mark as signifier and that which it is meant to signify. So in other words, abstraction and Africanness are made to signify together. And in fact, there is literally, I mean, this is way too literal, but sometimes I think unpacking a kind of literal, almost dumb obviousness can lead to something a little more important and exciting. That in a way, the Cubist line is this line of disruption, is this disruption introduced by the entry of the colony into the metropolis. But I think that to say only that is not going to be satisfying to most everyone, including myself, even though there is truth in it. What I'd like us to think about, rather, is a kind of alterity that is imminent to the making of a painting in itself, a form of alterity that inheres in the very way that the mark is organized on the canvas. And what I mean by this is that there is a distance within abstraction between what is represented and what represents it. Now, this is also, in a way, like abstraction 101, right? But it's really important to kind of think this through to its conclusion. So here I'm showing you a nude in 1904. It has nothing to do with Cubism yet by Picasso, nothing to do with the kinds of colonial alterity that I'm pointing out in the Demoiselles. And yet what you see here are ways in which the body is made foreign to itself through the mark itself. Notice how the breastplate, I think of it almost as, and the shoulder cap, which are of course part of her body, are in a lighter tone of yellow against the bronze torso, and the hand as well is picked out in those colors. There is a kind of alienation of the body from itself that happens through, I would argue, the alterity of painting itself. Now, this requires not a pure non-objective painting, but the encounter between a matrix of marks and something that is pointed to beyond it, but that is never fully captured. In other words, it's the alterity of representation itself. And Cézanne, is a great example of this in that he creates, and this is a work that's more or less contemporaneous with the Picasso seated nude, where the skein of marks here seems to suggest a landscape, but is always a kind of textile lifted off a landscape. This is the alterity of Cubism that is inherent to the line. And here we have a kind of standard, high analytic Cubist painting, the portrait of Daniel Henry Kahnweiler, where again, the body is always being lost to itself. The rhetoric of painting is being disseminated, but the body floats behind it through the mustache, the eyes, the hands, etc. So we could think here of abstraction as a pure loss to itself. This alterity, finally, is rooted in a set of overlapping planes, but there's another difference here. We've gone from the nude to the portrait to the harlequin, a figure of European theater and popular culture, a figure of masquerade and disguise. There's an intra-European alterity here that is articulated with the extra-European one of primitivism. So let's look again at the Demoiselle. What the detail in the figure, and I already kind of indicated this below, what this detail in the upper right allows us to see is that the abstraction, the colored lines, are suffused with the alterity of the so-called primitive. This, we might say, is the color line in Picasso. The color line that was present already in the loss of the figure to its representation. It is very significant that for Rosalind Krauss, one of the most prominent and intelligent commentators on Cubism, what I'm calling the color line of alterity constitutes a loss for Picasso, as I've been describing it. Precisely a loss, though Krauss does not put it in this way, of the plenitude of the Western tradition of painting. She writes, "It seems that this sense of withdrawal of touch from the field of the visual was experienced by Picasso as a passionate relation to loss, that the carnal objecthood of the model was withdrawing progressively, and that its loss was felt not as a triumph, but as a poignant tragedy, is registered in Picasso's art of 1910 and 1911. And here is his Ma Jolie, which, My Beautiful One, which was a popular song at the time, which is often thought to be a kind of portrait, if one can say that, of Picasso's lover at the time. So Krauss finishes by saying, she's saying that this loss of touch, this abstraction, is a poignant tragedy registered in Picasso's art of 1910 and 11 by the way that the work clings to the human figure and not to just any set of figures, but those of his friends and lovers." Unquote. It is quite apt that Krauss speaks of Picasso's abstraction as a form of loss, and even a tragedy, as she puts it. Conclusions such as this have long placed modernism in a tragic or heroic mode. But this has obscured a comic mode, as I mentioned earlier, of modernism that is not only exemplified by Colescott, but by many of Picasso's colleagues as well, such as Francis Picabia, all of the Dadaists, Surrealists, etc. In other words, I would like to argue in a broader version of this work that what Krauss calls the tragic withdrawal of Cubism is in fact only one side of the coin of modernism, which is a kind of comic refiguration, proliferation, satirization of the forms of alterity that here are experienced as loss. The color line, so let's turn then to think about comedy in Colescott and how the color line for Colescott might be one that introduces a comic form of modernism that we can hunt back already all the way to the moment of Picasso. In her important 1987 essay, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, the African-American literary theorist Hortense Spillers wrote, quote, "The names by which I am called in the public place render an example of signifying property plus. In order for me to speak a truer word concerning myself, I must strip down through layers of attenuated meanings, made in excess in time, over time, assigned by a particular historical order." So in other words, what Spillers is saying, that in order to enter a public space as a signifying agent, as opposed to the kind of object of stereotype, she must literally strip down through layers of attenuated meanings. In other words, take away, shear off the kind of barnacles of stereotype. In describing how African Americans must excavate the stereotypes to which they are subjected, she declares, quote, "Undressing these conflations of meaning would restore figurative possibility." I first want to think of Colescott's strategy as a kind of dressing and undressing of painting. And here I've kept a quality of this work from you until this moment, which is that there are two versions from the same year, one that is dressed and one that is undressed. So this idea of Spillers that the way that stereotype is lived as a projection, as a kind of condition of constraint, must be marked by a kind of process of dressing and undressing, here is somehow inscribed in this pair of paintings somewhat literally. These paintings suggest a double masquerade, Colescott masquerading as Picasso and women masquerading as images. But I think there's also a more literal color line that is established in how Colescott renders skin as a figure-ground relationship of white and black, and also a kind of cosmetic that rhymes with the costume of the polka-dotted red cheeks. So here, I just want to point out that in fact, the way the color line that he creates is extremely complex. First of all, the complexions of each of the women in this painting and the other are all different. So there is no real black or white. There's a spectrum of color. But even more important, the figure-ground relationship here in each of the figures is always a play between what counts as white and what counts as black. Notice how this figure has a ground, her body is grounded in a brown tone, but has extremely present highlights of the yellowish white pigmentation. Whereas the white figure has the opposite, is grounded in a kind of dark skin, and the whiteness is almost like a cosmetic, almost as though it's put on like one of those tanning creams that you can use, except in the opposite direction. And then here, in terms of the dressing and undressing, there's a way in which the blouse itself mirrors the cosmetic of the face, the red cheeks, which both women of color and white women in these paintings have, and also the lips. So there's a way in which the body is an extension of the costume itself, of the dress itself. In these ways, I believe that Colescott has denaturalized the color line. The color line has made unknowable on a certain level, in that white and black cannot be distinguished from one another, in much the way, or in a way analogous to how William Popel, for instance, has done so by creating ethnicities or colors of human skin that don't exist, such as blue people are a drop of water and a drop of halter. I'm falling for the joke here, or not getting the joke, which is part of many drawings like these, where he talks about people of many different colors, including colors that we use, but also colors like green and blue that don't exist, as far as I know, in actual human beings. If Krauss understood Picasso's color line as a form of loss, then, of tragedy, I believe that Colescott's practice of modernism is a form of comedy. On one side of the color line is tragedy, and on the other is comedy. And this makes sense too. By definition, tragedy pertains to the downfall and death of a character. In this case, it has to do with the loss of the plenitude of the Western tradition. Comedy, on the other hand, is characterized by repetition with indifference. It's satirical, ironic, mechanical. In other words, comedy is always about a kind of repeating, doubling, uncanny return of the same, but with a difference. Rather than a loss of plenitude, comedy is an instance of what Spillers called signifying property plus. In other words, too much image thrown at you, too much stereotype to carry. It confronts social loss, in this case the dispossession of African Americans from official American culture, with cruel satire. Tragedy is very familiar to us in modern art. The loss it expresses is in fact a tool for enormous gain, as we know from the great popularity of this painting just up the street at MoMA. The creative destruction that characterizes capitalism is homologous to the highly successful tragedy of modernism, which is always leading to its own demise and reinvention, right? That is the idea of the avant-garde, that it's always creatively destroying that which comes before and building something new. Comedy, however, has not been a concept associated with modernism to such a great extent. And for that reason, I wish to explore its role further, not only in this lecture, but as I mentioned, in a series of lectures that I'm giving as well, where I try to think through this model of the comic more fully than I can tonight. But in her book, Laughter Fit to Kill, literary theorist Glenda Carpio theorizes black humor, including that of Colescott and Carol Walker, whom she writes about explicitly, as a demand for freedom and justice. In other words, if tragedy is a loss, comedy can be a demand for something which one doesn't even have. She writes, quote, "Black humor began as a wrested freedom," in other words, a freedom wrested from slavery, the freedom to laugh at that which was unjust and cruel in order to create a distance from what would otherwise obliterate a sense of self and community. Again, this distance that Spillers talks about through dressing and undressing. It's a realm of stereotype that can become political. Carpio quotes the important and pioneering African-American curator Lowry Stokes Sims as saying, "As oppressive as they can be, stereotypes are a quotidian form of exposure that, quote, kept black people at the center of American consciousness. We didn't disappear into the fringes, we were everywhere." So first, one could say that stereotype, as cruel and racist as it can be, is also a space of visibility that can be repurposed through reiteration and re-signification. Such comedy is a place of inversion, whereas the African-American art historian Huey Copeland has put it, Colescott's paintings, quote, deploy nothing less than the volatile genre of blackface, imposing a negative inversion of our cultural imaginary. And I would say that in a way, Colescott not only is playing with blackface, but also with whiteface on some level, in the sense that it's, as the point I was making before, that one could argue, and you might find this argument a little far, going a little too far, but I think we can see it in the painting. These figures are painted in ways that don't allow them a secure whiteness. We can imagine them as whiteface, as well as the stereotypes of blackface, I think. There's a politics of what I like to call travesty here, to think about masquerade, the dressing and undressing, the comic grotesquerie of painting as opposed to its tragic avant-gardism. A travesty of painting in which surface itself is a kind of masquerade, is a kind of color line. But for now, I mean, this again is an argument, sorry, this lecture is part of a series, so there are little parts that I didn't cross out that allude to the next, but I want to kind of think about this repressed form of travesty in a more sustained way, as I've mentioned to you. But for now, let me end with Colescott's own account of the humor in his work, when he says, if you decide to laugh, don't forget the humor of the bait. And once you've bitten, you may have to do some serious chewing. The tears may come later. In other words, from the artist's mouth, comedy may end up as tragedy by other means. Thank you very much.
The triple alterity, like as a framework, I guess I was wondering if you felt like it was, you had boiled it down so that it was sufficient in, addressing this wide net of modernism, or if you felt tempted to include any other categories in that
making a quadruple alterity.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, how you came down to those three. I mean, they seem like they catch wide, but.
Well, actually, you sort of seem like a plant, maybe, but you're not. But actually, there is another that I realized in thinking through, again, a sort of avant-garde and contemporary linkage. And that is, and I'm thinking about it sort of through the work of Picabia and also Picasso, how the most canonical European painters of the early 20th century moved through several different styles in ways that were contradictory. And what I want to argue is that this kind of, style is often linked to the self as an integral quality, right? Your hand, your sense of perspective on the world, whatever term you want to use. So style, in a way, is a kind of essential window into the truth of an individual artist, let's say. And this is a very modernist thing to believe. But in fact, many modernist artists, and I'll just go, sorry, close your eyes if you don't like flashing lights. I mean, this is within, 10 years, and we could have more extreme examples. So in fact, style is completely denaturalized as a link to a holistic perspective or self. And so my fourth alterity has to do with an alterity within the self, with a kind of form of making that in fact is not linked to an essential set of characteristics. So if I write this project, that'll be the fourth one. And I just want to say, because the term boiling down, I don't take offense to it, but it does have a certain kind of valence, as though I'm doing a certain violence to the work, which I may, in fact, be doing. But that's what critics do. Models are either they're helpful or they're not. But it's generated from looking at the work. I mean, you can argue with my conclusions, but I didn't come with this. I arrived at it through a process of thinking about what was going on in these works. And the question I really wanted to answer for myself was, because, as Mark mentioned, I've been doing quite a bit of work on contemporary painting. It started as a sort of sideline, and then it just kept, there were more things that I wanted to do. I feel like there's a vast amount of modern painting in the West, let's just stick to the West, that is somehow outside of the kind of discourse of people like me because of its figuration. And Colescott is one big example of that, but I could name, 100 others, as probably all of you could. Maybe some of you belong to that category as artists. So I really wanted to kind of think, like, how can we really, and that's why for me the sort of Picasso argument's really important, which, some of you may find that problematic, but to me, I think I'm really interested in rethinking the modern from the absolutely canonical in order to open a space that will not be a peripheral space, that will be an absolutely central space. I think that that's important. And so that's why the triple alterity isn't just a kind of, aren't I clever kind of thing, though, every model is a way of showing off. But it's also a way of thinking a set of practices that are inconceivable according to a certain model of modernism, that even though it's been criticized like crazy, is still absolutely in effect in kind of rhetorical assumptions. I mean, I don't know of any real account of figuration in the 20th century aside from pop that has the kind of power and persuasion of the model of cubism that has been elaborated by my teachers and colleagues in the October Circle.
Do you think that that has to do with like the centrality of like form as an idea, has sort of like kept a lot of other practices, especially with regards to returns to figuration, on the periphery?
Well, I mean, painting has a double bind. It's or maybe a triple bind, sorry. The three thing is very, the threes are very seductive. First of all, the Trinity after all. First of all, painting was rendered obsolete by the inheritors of a certain kind of avant-garde. So that's one of painting's problems. Secondly, painting, is the darling of the market. Those two. So on the one hand, it is critically problematic from a certain art historical point of view. On the other hand, it's commercially problematic. So I think that the discourse has been suppressed on account of that kind of, maybe that's a double bind. I forgot what the triple was. Maybe it doesn't exist. Yeah.
I have a question. In a way, it's more like related to like painting as being an object of like creating visual culture. And the question might be a little bit of sort of the case study here, and a little bit beyond of the picture as a way. But I was thinking about like how can we see this conversational alterity in regards to context, the context in which a piece of work is shown in modern art. In a way, and having account this in history as like how in contemporary, this has also been like the challenging of the institution in a way, and how this can also like change the meaning of a piece of work, of a work or a painting in this case.
Mm-hmm. I actually don't think I don't understand what context explains actually, because I feel like what exactly, I think context is as much a critical, what you call context is as much a critical choice as what you call the rest of your archive. I mean, this is a post-structuralist insight that has been made by Derrida and others, but I think that in the social history of art, for instance, takes criticism at the time, contemporaneous criticism as the social context, but I mean, why is that more valuable than whoever saw the paintings whose work is lost, whose responses are lost to us? So actually, I think this might be like completely disgusting perspective, but it is actually what I think, which is that I think that art wants to have a long duration, and that the context is actually not that explanatory or important. I think that, or to me, it's not that interesting, because I think it doesn't really, I think art wants to be out of time on some level in a really profound way, and that no artist that I know, maybe there are exceptions here that want to claim this, but I've never met an artist who wanted their work to lose its relevance, next year. So why would we interpret it that way? I think that what is interesting is how different times, different temporalities circulate within single objects. To me, that's really interesting. So I guess that Alterity for me is partly about how these different time zones can mix together. I don't know if that's exactly satisfying to you or not.
I know. I think it's an interesting point, but I was referring more to context as in like the place in which is shown a work, or like the way that is displayed, or not as much as like the social context, like temporal context in which a show existed or was created, but more like to, in a way, like to the public that is shown, or like the institution that is shown, which kind of like maybe related to that specific, but yeah, I think that was it.
But I mean, in this sense, you have to, again, it's really about a choice. I mean, you make your historical archive along with your visual archive. So, Picasso didn't show this work until later in his life, and then it went to MoMA, and like, at which point, is it his keeping it back, or is it his showing it? And I haven't done enough research on Colescott's paintings to know their history either, but which particular context would be the appropriate one? That's why I guess I just will unapologetically say that I think that what interests me is trying to think models from the works, which is not to say to ignore history, but to think how they're using history as part of their own substance. That is more satisfying to me, because I feel like then I know what I'm working with and I can defend it because it's there.
Hi, I have a question, sort of continue about this contest-wise especially in contemporary paintings, or what we say contemporary arts. The authorities in culture creates problems in some contents, because we now know more about different cultures, but then the knowledge we have right now at present kind of creates this weird stereotypes we put into paintings in contemporary art, and it causes the confusion into the visual languages. I was just wondering what's your thoughts about contemporary art when we have alternatives in culture, and then we kind of mix them into what stage would be a good visual rather than a confusion to read, or a negative stereotype to read from cross cultures.
Yeah,
Kinda.
I mean, I guess I would say that I think when that works well is when a stereotype is thought of as dynamic as opposed to static. In other words, where the work of art is involved in performing in some way how the stereotype behaves, as opposed to reiterating the stereotype in the way that it behaves. So, sometimes that's through exaggeration, sometimes it's through juxtaposition, sometimes it's through kind of denaturing it by changing its terms visually. There are a lot of strategies, I think, for dealing with that. But, it's explosive, but I think it's important, because I think that I actually think that painting is a place where you can slow images down, and that's one of its virtues as a medium. And you can sort of see an image in multiple temporalities. That doesn't mean showing motion itself, but in different sort of experiential, like this, I feel like, just the idea that her body, I don't know if all of you see it the way I do, but I find this, it's also just a slide, but the painting is very powerful in how it's almost as though her body is lost to herself. It's a very powerful phenomenological feeling that often occurs in Picasso's work. And this self-loss, for instance, is one way of thinking stereotype outside of itself. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's a question or more a reflection, mine. So the painting that you show at the beginning was the Venus of Urbino of Tiziano. Then you show the Olympia of Manet, and then the Mademoiselle d'Avignon of Picasso. And for me, it was interesting to see, maybe it's just the example that you take, but how the time is alterate this alternity in the work, no? So we have a big jump of 400 years from the two first images, and then just more than like 50 years or a little bit more. So what is interesting in me now, in the contemporary time that we live, where all this information, the culture are more mixed, which can be the place that take the role of alterity now, like in the work, that everything is that mixed with the globalization and this.
Well, I mean, I actually think that's one of the things that art can do. I mean, I think that art can show that difference and kind of, I want to call it, I mean, difference is such an anodyne term. I mean, a kind of vertigo or loss, a kind of affect of both assault of images and a withdrawal from them. I think that art can, you know, the quote that, well, it's not quite the quote Mark read, but one of the things I try to argue in this little book, After Art, is that it's really that art can kind of make visible forms of circulation that are so instantaneous that we almost don't notice them anymore. So I think it's, I mean, it goes back to the question of time. I think that art dilates time and sort of uses time as a material, not just, you know, video and moving and film, but painting too. And that's why I feel like her breast and hand are in a totally different experiential time zone than the rest of her body. And for me, that makes this painting interesting and compelling. So, I mean, I think that art can visualize things that are beneath the sort of level of perception in that kind of instantaneity that you're talking about.
I don't really understand alterity and type specifically. It seemed in the presentation at one point type was kind of a stand-in for stereotype. And I believe after that, type was instead a stand-in for space, right? It was like, what's the substance? What is being deconstructed? What is being worked with? And so I just want to understand what you specifically mean by type, and also why you use the term type to like denote that.
I wanted purposely, well, okay, there are two questions there. Why type, and what is the type? So what I would argue is that type is a kind of continuous, meaningful form that travels through time. So it could be the nude, it could be a certain kind of racist stereotype of African American men, but it's one that persists but continuously is changed. So there's a kind of difference within it, even as you recognize it as a persistent form. And so the alterity there is the difference within the sameness. And that's how I would kind of think that. So this is an alterity that is not about outsides. It's about one's own tradition. Well, it can be in the Western tradition. It can also be a vicious stereotype. So the reason I didn't use the term stereotype as opposed to type is that I wanted the model to be neutral in terms of its valence with regard to the violence that it may do to those that it depicts and that who are looking at it. So a stereotype isn't always negative, but almost always, I would think, considered as a negative thing. Whereas a type is, more neutral. And so it allows for some types to continue as a kind of, let's say, productive relationship to a heritage that has affirmative values, whereas a stereotype might be an effort to kill or re-signify something that is doing violence.
Thank you. I enjoyed your lecture a lot. So I want to try to take a half step back and think about what you're doing in terms of attempting to reformulate modernism. I would imagine that you're not alone in this project of rethinking and extending modernism to understand it as a more inclusive term. You talked about the long modernism, suggested that modernism isn't over. We can subsume postmodernism within the rubric of modernism and then also perhaps include the contemporary. So a literary theorist, Frederick Jameson, famously formulated postmodernism as the cultural logic of late capitalism. We might then understand modernism as the cultural logic of fill in the blank. Capitalism, or extractive capitalism, or empire, or colonization, or race power, etc. As a cultural formation that's symptomatic of or expressive of various different, say, distributions of power in the world. I guess I would maybe also suggest that, so what you've identified the structural relationship between terms of alterity, along the lines of time, along the lines of type, culture, and then, although you didn't discuss this, style as expression of self or identity, perhaps. Might it be that it's that relationship of alterity, or maybe one could say displacement, that is most inherent for your argument, and that one could fill in the blank of the vector of alterity in all kinds of different ways? I mean, you've identified 3 or 4 main ones, but as someone else maybe suggested, there could be many, many in different moments or applied to different particular formations or works?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. With regard to late capital, I think that the most interesting historical accounts that I know of now are really trying to think about the rise of capitalism in the 19th century as indistinguishable or as inextricably tied to colonialism and slavery, which was, a really efficient way of accumulating capital. So and then there are artists like Cameron Rowland who are now making a connection between the American, prison industrial complex and forced labor and the moment of indentured labor and slavery. So that's a strong reading, but I think that capitalism, always had a racial dimension and continues to. And I think late capitalism makes sense as opposed to creating a boundary between whatever would be before late capitalism, early capitalism, and late capitalism, because I do think that, in fact, I just don't see that there's a real epistemological difference that can really be thought of as a completely different set of practices. I think they're really different singularities. So then can it be alterity anything? I actually don't think so. I think that if you look at work, I feel like there isn't an infinite number of types. But I do think that what happens is that painting goes from establishing a presence to dealing with a kind of absence or dispossession. And I think that comedy is often used by those who are dispossessed in various ways. And modernism has been focused around a kind of tragic avant-gardist sense of perpetual loss. So I think maybe in the long run, this project, the alterity dimension might be a kind of scaffolding that will fall away to think about this mood of the comic as opposed to the mood of the tragic within modernism. But I think, you know how it is with projects that you sort of, I think of it as scaffolding, like you need a lot of apparatus to figure out what you actually really think and what's important, and thanks for being my guinea pigs. And then, you know, you clean away what doesn't seem necessary. So this is very new for me, and I'm not, so maybe the alterity is too baggy a term, actually. I don't know.
I like it. You used the metaphor of boiling down before, or someone did. And, you know, in that regard, I think it's maybe interesting to think of art history as a kind of cuisine.
As a sauce.
Is
a
there
sauce
perhaps
that we throw on you
is
artists?
there a remaining burning question?
Just kind of on the last bit, you were saying that this is a new kind of idea that you're kind of formulating. I'm curious about the process of creating a model and what your research kind of looks like and how these things kind of exist as essays or a lecture series or as an accumulation of a book, and just what the process looks like of coming up with this.
Thank you. I just finished a book on globalization, and so in a way where I had a lot of rules for myself, and one of them was to really do everything possible, even though I'm trained in Western art and based in New York, to decenter that. So I think I taught myself a few things in this book, and this series of lectures is a kind of bringing those strategies from a kind of attempt to understand globalization as a mechanism within the art world, or within the practice of art, not the art world per se, to the Western canon. So in a way, that's the logic of it for me. And I would like it to be a little short book, but you know, I'm not sure yet if it will be.
Do you mind just adding on what your research looks like what it entails? Is it just a lot of, do you go see these paintings in person, or do you have readings, or what does that look like?
Yeah, I try never to talk about something I haven't seen in person. If I can't see something that I really want to talk about in person, then for instance, I went to, I didn't see the Colescott, the one, the Washington Carver crossing the Delaware, but the one, there's a great painting at MoMA that's up now, and I spent a lot of time thinking about that painting. And it's helpful because when you see one, you can sort of think about strategies that might migrate to others. So, but in general, if I'm writing a book, I mean, there are a few exceptions when in kind of urgent cases, but I don't like to write about things I haven't seen. I mean, I think it's better not to, because you learn a lot by looking at the actual thing. I mean, anyway.